Welcome to the greatest Zoom college fair of all time. My name is Gino Kwok, and I'm a school board member here with Hacienda La Puente Unified School District. I'm also a member of the Board of Directors for the California School Board Association. CSBA represents all 1,000 school districts, all 5,000 school board members, and 6.2 million public school kids in the state of California. I'm also on the board of CIF, which is the high school sports, and I'm a trial lawyer with over 20 years of experience. This is my 7th year doing the workshop, and of course we have to give it up to the one and only Ian Calderon, who's the majority leader of the Assembly and the 57th Assembly District, because his college fair is the best in the state of California. California, as you know, is the 5th largest economy, not in America, but in the world. And as a trial lawyer, I'm going to be your lawyer because I'm going to be your advocate. I'm going to tell you and give you ideas of what to expect on the UC application, to master the UC application, so that we're going to do great things for your future. So as a trial lawyer, there's certain things that we always hold as sacrosanct. One is you have to know your audience, and the second part is never underestimate your audience. So your audience here is what I call the reader, more specifically the admissions reader. This is the person who's going to read your application. And you cannot underestimate what they think or what they're going to read, because these are people that literally read over 1,000, literally thousands of these applications. So they've seen it all, they've heard it all, and they've read it all. So based upon that, you have to be who you are, because that's what they're going to look for. They're going to look for genuineness, sincerity, and credibility. As a trial lawyer, we always do one thing, right? We win cases. So I'm going to show you how to put your best case forward. Now, the UC application is very interesting because it deals with the 9 UC campuses here in California. If you live in California, you really don't know how great, perhaps, the UC system is. It is by far the #1 state system, not only in the entire country, but literally in the world. If you take a look, 8 of the 9 UC campuses are ranked in the top 100 colleges in America. And when you think about that, it's staggering because there are over 2,500 universities in this country. So to be in the top 100, think about that. You're talking about certainly not even the top 10, not even the top 5%. You're talking about an incredibly elite list. So again, 8 out of 9 are there, and all 9 within the top 150. But even more than that, if you take a look at the top public universities in this country, the top 10, the UC system occupies half of them. Yes, you heard it. 5 out of the top 10 public universities in America are UCs. What's better than 5 out of 10? How about 6 out of 12? And there you have it. 6 out of the top public institutions in this country are UCs. I want to congratulate you for being here watching this, because if you think about it, there are very few transformative moments in your life. And I know you're young, but let me tell you what they're going to be. One is when you get married. Another one is when you have your first child, as an example. But here, going to college, and which college, that's a big event. It'll have an impact on you, literally, for the rest of your life. The University of California prides itself for these 3 attributes. 1 is educational quality. 2 is alumni success. And 3 is affordability. You get the bang out of your buck. So what we're going to concentrate on today are the questions that you have to answer. They're called the personal insight questions. People have before just termed it colloquially as the college essays, but they're personal insight questions. And if you take a look at your UC application, literally 99% of the time that a student is going to spend on the application is going to be on these questions, the personal insight questions, otherwise known as the PIQs. So this area is by far the most time-consuming and the most challenging. But being here, you realize that you'll be able to get invaluable insight on how to do it. And just to give you an idea, last year, over 200,000 students applied to entry into the UC. About 177,000 was incoming freshmen. The other would be transfers. So, for you to be here to watch this video, I can tell you, 200,000 are not going to be watching this, even if that would be a great thing. You're watching this, you're putting in your homework, you're going to get something out of this. It's going to be something that you can really, really use, which is why we're here. And I can tell you another aspect about this. This is my 7th year, I've been doing this now for some time. I could literally teach a course on this. So this is an overview. It's not going to be exhaustive, but it's going to cause you to think and ruminate about the best way to go. So let me give you some background, because you need to have context. So back in 2008, they came up with 2 prompts, right? These were their essay questions, but the UC didn't want to call them essay questions. They call them prompts. So you have prompt 1, prompt 2, and then you had a optional one. So let me tell you what prompt 1 was. Prompt 1 was this question. Describe the world that you come from, your community, your school, your family. And tell us how your world has shaped your dreams and aspirations. That was prompt 1. Prompt 2 was as follows. Tell us about a personal quality, talent, experience, accomplishment that is important to you. And then tell us why you're proud of it and how it relates to who you are. So these 2 questions were a big deal. And if you look at it, you always want to ask yourself this: what are they trying to get at? What's the point? Well, the first question was essentially asking you information to tell to your reader, the admissions office, of who you're going to be in the future. The second question was essentially asking you who you are today. And back then, they gave you 1,000 words, and they let you divide it up between those 2 questions. And then they gave you an additional comment one, which was optional. And the additional comment word box basically said, hey, tell us any information that you couldn't tell us in the rest of the application. It was like the catch-all, right? And in that one, they gave you 550 words. So I would ask students, before we went to the PIQs, how would you divide it up? And then I would ask them, would you actually do the additional comment section? And then the third question I would ask them is, can you make an argument as to why the additional comment section was important to do? Because nobody wants to do additional comments. That's more work. And the answer to the last question was this. Remember, they gave you 1,000, strike that, 1,000 words for 2 questions, right? Prompt 1, prompt 2, right? So if you just go and make it divisible, right? You could say that it's 500 words per question. But what do they give you for additional comments? At that time, they gave you 550 words. So think about it. You can certainly make a very cogent argument that additional comments actually was more weighty than the other 2. Now, what happened here was that the UCs didn't like these questions, right? And the reason why they didn't like them was simply because they didn't get responses that they could properly evaluate. So they tossed everything out, and they came up with a different system. They wanted to get responsive answers that they felt were more relevant, what they were looking for, more germane. So, as a trial lawyer, we always have to know context. So where did they come up with these questions? So, as a trial lawyer, you always want and care about what? You care about what the law is, right? So, as a lawyer, we say this: if the facts are on your side, argue the facts. If the law is on your side, argue the law. But if neither the facts or law are on your side, just argue. So, in here, what is the governing law? And the governing law is the 14 comprehensive factors that have been identified by the UC admissions process. These 14 factors were drafted and put together by a faculty committee across the entire UC. And these factors were done before '08 when the prompts came in. So those prompts, although they were going to be superseded, the factors still remain. But now they had to come up with the questions. So now the question here is, well, how did that happen? Well, who better to come up with the questions than the admissions directors? So they got together across the UC and they came up with the questions, and believe me, it was an arduous process. So they finally came up with them through many drafts, and they came up with 8, and then you select 4. There's a 350-word maximum on each response. And you can only select 4. You cannot select 3, you cannot select 5. It's only 4. And so the 4, as we will talk about, are essentially leading questions. They still want to know the answers that they were seeking in the previous prompts, but this time they're going to give you some of the context about that. So, all of the questions are going to do what? They're going to relate back to the 14 comprehensive factors. So, just briefly going through those factors, you can go ahead and divide them into 2 categories: academic and non-academic. And we're not going to discuss all of these, but obviously you would know this. So it would be your grade point average, your A through G, your A through G plus, for example, honors classes, AP classes, IB classes, and college classes. It would also be your class rank, things of that sort. Then you've got the non-academic, right? Essentially, for example, and again, I won't go through all those either, there are a number of them. Remember, they add up to 14. But a couple of them are interesting, and one of them is embedded in the first prompt, which was your school, your community, where you come from, things of that sort. Another one that I view interesting is your geographic location. So that's also relevant here. But again, you should go ahead and take a look at that. Now, I'll also tell you this. Every year, doing the PIQs is going to be, again, the most challenging, the highest degree of difficulty. But take a look at it this year. I will tell you, the wonderful thing about the PIQs is you're the master of your own fate. You have to tell your story, not someone else's story, your story. So because of that, your future depends on yourself. And isn't that empowering as opposed to something so important as your future being dependent on somebody else? This is where you can go ahead and tell who you are and what you stand for. But this year is different. And why is it different? Well, you know why it's different, right? So let's talk about the elephant in the room. It's different because we're going through a worldwide pandemic. We're going through stay-at-home orders. We're going through social distancing. So that's going to be different, which means you may want to think about how you're going to address that in your essays. The other part that's going to be significantly different is that the UCs have gone through a test optional for the ACT and the SAT. What does that mean? That means you don't have to take it. Now, you can take it, and presumably it'll have an impact on the admissions decision, but it's not required. So, if that's the case, then guess what? That means your essays are even more important, right? Now, I was talking with a colleague of mine, and I was telling them that no matter what anybody tells you, including the UCs, and the reason why I've been doing this for 7 years is because I get an overwhelming reaction and attendance at my workshop. It's because I tell you what's going on. I tell you the real scoop. So what they'll do is, you're not going to hear necessarily people that say, well, they actually grade them, because nobody wants to say or admit that they're being graded, but they are being graded. And then the question is, well, how do you grade these things? Well, you know they're being graded. Why? Well, again, you have 2,000 applicants. Not everybody's going to get in. And then you've got some of our campuses where our acceptance rates range from 12% to over 50%. If in fact there was no grading, anybody and everybody who applied, who met the minimum standards, would get accepted. But that's just not the case. So there is a grading process to that. So you have to keep that in mind. I would only tell you this, that the grading is not uniform. So what does that mean? Well, all the other things are uniform, right? The 14 comprehensive factors, which of course makes it a holistic review of your application, and the PIQs themselves, but the grading is not. The grading actually is done on a campus-by-campus basis. And who makes the decision on the grading? Of course, the faculty, right? So, in that situation, a select number of faculty from each UC campus, they convene, and then they give a certain amount of points or weight to each of the elements. So that's how it's done. So, you have to understand, it is an active process. And also, not every UC campus is going to give the same weight to something, one of the elements. And that's the reason why sometimes an applicant will get into one UC and not get into another UC. That's the way it works. Now, there's a lot of other things that go into it, but that's enough for what right now. Remember, I said I could give a dissertation and a course on this, but at least you should know what you're getting yourself into. It is one application for all 9 UCs. So keep that in mind. Just one. So if it's one, remember, know your audience. And here's what that means. It's like, if you want to be an anteater and go to UC Irvine, you might not want to say that you want to be an anteater. Why? Because if you apply to, for example, UCLA, and UCLA they're the home of the Bruins, they probably won't like the fact that you want to be an anteater, right? So don't do that. Don't go ahead and be campus specific because, again, it's one application for all 9 campuses. You do not have to apply to all 9 campuses. You can apply to 1, as an example, as few as 1, and as many as 9. Obviously, most applicants would apply to multiple UC campuses. Remember the 3 points about UC that I mentioned earlier. Educational excellence, alumni success, and affordability. Guess how much it costs for an application? I believe it's somewhere around $70 per campus, which is very affordable. Now, there are 8 sections to the UC application, but I'm only going to highlight 3 very, very quickly, because these are the ones that really deal with your life. The first section is about you. So there's a section asking about information about you, your family, and so forth. Another section is activities and awards. And why is that important? Because the UC wants to know what you've been doing with your time. And nothing is more important, of course, now because of what we're going through today. So that's going to be particularly important. And of course, the third section that is of paramount importance is the personal insight questions. And remember how they call it. So if you ever wondered why they call them prompts, right, instead of college essays, and now they're calling personal insight questions, let me tell you why. Because they're not essays. They're questions. They want you to respond to the question. And so that's why that is important. Now, when you do an essay question, what happens? You have an opening, a middle, and a conclusion. You have topic sentences. They don't want that. They just want you to answer the question. This is the equivalent of a personal interview. And so everybody will tell you that. This is a personal interview, except it's on paper. But the difference is that the quack is going to tell you something different, which is, think of it this way. It is an interview. It is on paper. However, you should think about that you're playing both the interviewee and the interviewer. And the reason why that's important is because there are going to be questions when they read your application that the interviewer would want to ask you, but they can't ask you. So you've got to be able to anticipate. You've got to be able to explain. So think about that. That is very important on that. Because if there's an obvious question there on your record, whether it be in the classroom or outside the classroom, they're going to want to know the answer to it. And so you have to respond to that. So just keep that in mind. You have to be honest with yourself. All right, the PIQ, again, 8 questions. And so what are they? Just very briefly going through that. They're going to mirror the 14 factors. So you have leadership. You have one on leadership. You've got creativity. You've got one on your greatest talent and skill. You've got one on any education opportunity that you were able to take advantage of, or any educational barrier that you were able to overcome. The 5th one would be any significant challenge that you've encountered, and the steps that you took to address it, and how it had impact on you on academic achievement. The 6th question would be the one that deals with, is there any academic subject matter that inspired you in some way? The 7th one is, have you made your community or school better? And the 8th one deals with, is there anything that makes you different? Very interesting question, I would tell you, the 8th question. For a long time, when I first saw it, when it first came out, and the PIQs first came out in 2016, 2017 for that academic year, so now we're in the 4th year. I looked at it, and I viewed it in a certain way, but now I view it in a different way. So that question is a very good question. And it's a question you should consider answering. But that question asks, again, whether there's anything about you that makes you stand out as a candidate for admission into the UC. So, a lot of times people think of, well, this is something I want to talk about, something positive or so forth. But that's not the case. It gives you wide range of ability. So go ahead and think about it. Now, remember what I said. You got to know your audience. Never underestimate your audience. When you're the admissions reader, do you have any idea of how many PIQs they read? You know, before they only read 2, right, and maybe additional comments. Now they're reading a minimum of 4, right? So they literally have to go through with so many, and they're on a time schedule because admissions decisions have to come back at a certain period of time. So you can only imagine how much they read, right? And so what do you want to do? You want to make their life easier, right? Make their life easier. If you make their life easier, they will reward you. So even if it's 350 words, and believe me, when I applied to the UC, we didn't have a word counter. I actually had to do this with a pen on a piece of paper. Yes, I know. You look at us, and when we think about these things, and I had my daughter one time, and she asked me what was a fax machine. And yes, this is a time where the dinosaurs roamed the earth, but I will tell you right now that even at that time, the shorter the number of words, the better you would be. And there's certain truths that are not only self-evident, but they are universal. So make it as short as you can, right? Answer the question. So if somebody's going through and reading everything, and all of a sudden they're always trying to catch up on time, right? And they can't do it because they have to read all this other stuff. But if you go ahead and allow them to catch up quickly because you've done a great job, you made it succinct, you've used fewer words, they're going to adore you, right? So I'll give you an idea as an example. Remember, no structure like an essay. So let me give you a point about this as an exercise. So this would be about Labor Day. We just went through Labor Day. So let's go through this exercise. So let's say the question was, what do you think about Labor Day? Labor Day, a time to celebrate the dedicated employees that make the greatest invention of all time possible, public education. This is a magical place where the seemingly ordinary people do extraordinary things to elevate and inspire our children and our country. It is the teacher and not the publicly elected official who educates our kids. It is the worker who deserves a living wage and not the project manager that builds each and every one of our classrooms. It is the classified employee and not private enterprise that feeds, transports, and protects our kids in our schools. They are distinguished by their dedication, sacrifice, and commitment to all children, regardless of who they are or where they come from. On this day, we salute them all. Our public employees, our essential workers, our heroes. So I give you that example because how many words do you think I just used? I'll tell you. I used 134 words. So have an idea of your word count. You don't need 350 words. But I know that there's some people that always want to have a road mark. So I would tell you, you probably, again, this is not a universal truth, but it's a guideline. You probably need to use at least 250 words to get your point across. So remember that. And why is that the case? Because you don't want to say, oh, you're a really responsible person, right? Of course, that's an important attribute to have. You need to explain it. You need to provide facts of that. Example, you had a soccer match, but it started to rain, and nobody knew how they were going to be able to play. So you saw the situation, and so you decided to call everybody up, and then you put together the uniforms, the cleats that had to be different because you were on a wet turf. You made sure that there were drinks for everybody. You made sure that there were towels. You made sure there were umbrellas, right? That's how you show your level of responsibility and problem-solving skills, and empathy, and teamwork. Not, don't say it, show it. So when you go ahead and do this, the UC is going to tell you there are three things that you want to show, right? Just generally speaking. And here's what they are. Clarity, context, and depth. So think about that, right? You want to go ahead and show clarity because you want to show a really rich perspective of your life, right? Because they don't know you. And remember, they're looking at thousands of these things. So you need to go ahead and give that part of it. Context, of course, right? What is it about? Again, it goes back to prompt 1. Way back then, right? When you tell them about your community, your school, your family, and so forth and so on. And then depth, just giving examples of what they are. So you do have to go ahead and do that. I'd also tell you this. When you think about writing this, think of also that you want to be reflective. You want to think and show that you've been thinking about certain parts of this. I have a child right now. It's kind of difficult for me to believe, but she's a freshman this year. And because of the pandemic, she had no promotion for 8th grade. And so that was tough. And so she was concerned about that. And she thought, well, she might not be prepared to go to high school because high school is a big jump. But these are the things that you have to talk about, right? What did you go through? What was your thought process with respect to this thing? You want to be able to share that level of detail. So again, reflective, right? And certainly you want to be able to capture times where something was transformative. It changed your mind about something, right? You never thought about something. All of a sudden, oh my God, here's something that is important, right? So, give you an example. Somebody who goes out there and they thought, well, you know, they wanted to go out for cross country. And the parents didn't think that much about cross country, right? They thought it was an individual sport and so forth. But then all of a sudden the child tells a story like that. And then it's then pointed out that, you know, when she went out for cross country, she realized it was an incredible sport. One is, of all the sports that are in middle school, or even in high school for that matter, name me a sport, especially in middle school, that's going to cause you, and you know it's going to happen, it's going to be pain and discomfort, right? Because you're going over long distances, and also the weather is very warm, right? So, you could talk about that. Another one of it is, people think that cross country is an individual sport. That's not true. Because in cross country, they only count like the first number of times. So let's say it's the first 6 times, right? Everybody else doesn't count. Well, guess what? Even if you're not in the top 6 of your team, you want to be as high as possible because the quicker that you make it, then an opponent would drop down. So you're able to go down. Another thing about that, you can go ahead and set the pace for somebody. Let somebody draft behind you. Again, teamwork, right? But the normal person who doesn't think about it, they wouldn't know anything about that. But if you were to say something like that as an example in an essay, it's phenomenal. Why? Because you lived through it. That's what it is. Again, just an example. If you look at the PIQs, all of them have multiple parts, right? It isn't just one part. They all have at least 2 parts. Do not overthink the question, right? Don't overthink it. Just answer it. I'll give you an example. When you take a look at the question, you also want to make sure that you don't look at it too narrowly, right? So here's an example. So the first PIQ goes something like this. Describe a leadership experience and how you positively influence others, resolve a dispute, or contributed to a group effort over time. Now, if you're like most students, you don't really talk about yourself. And I will tell you this right now. This is the one inherent difficulty about this, is because you need to talk about yourself, right? And most of us are not comfortable talking about ourselves, but you're going to have to go ahead and do that. So some of us don't think about ourselves as a leader, right? So if you're not the captain of this team or the president of this club or association, you think, oh, that's not one for me. Not true. Read the question. They're asking not about your leadership position. They're not asking about your leadership official title, right? They're asking you about your leadership experience. So, in my last soccer example, you didn't have to be the captain of the soccer team, or football, as they say in other parts of the world, but tell me you didn't show leadership in that circumstance. You showed immense leadership, and not only that, it was genuine. So, do not look at it, again, too narrowly. Also, you can define certain key terms. Example, in PIQ 7, they ask you, what have you done to make your school or community better? Now, community doesn't mean your greater community, right? Your community can be defined as your team, your club, your association, your family, your church. So, in that situation, when you have latitude, take advantage of it. Another thing about this is that this is not a competition with anybody else. So for example, if you saw somebody and they were the president of ASB, right? And they were the captain of this, and they went out there and they did all these great things. Don't think that that person has an inherent advantage over you, and in responding to this PIQs, that's not true. Just because you didn't do those things doesn't mean you didn't have any leadership experience, as an example. It doesn't mean that you didn't do all these other great things that are very worthwhile. It's not a competition in that regard. The only competition is with yourself. As long as you tell your story, and you tell it in the best way, in the most comprehensive way possible, you'll be fine. You just want to be the best version of yourself. Another part that I would tell you about the PIQ. So people think that the 4 and 5 are the same. Remember, PIQ 4 is essentially asking you about any educational opportunity you took advantage of and any educational barrier that you were able to overcome. 5 asks you about the most significant challenge you had in your life. What steps you took to overcome that challenge, and how it impacted your academic achievement and so forth and so on. They're not the same. Because one is dealing with academics. The other one is dealing with who you are as a person outside of academics. So, on the one hand, you could have said something like this as an example. And always try to get the best bang for your buck, right? So you could say that you want to take a couple of AP classes, but you couldn't take the 2 AP classes because there was a scheduling conflict, right? And so you unfortunately had to only take one, but then you were able to go ahead and take a class like that in your local community college. Well, what an ideal example on that. Why is that? Because number one, you answered both parts of the question, because or usually is disjunctive, right? But you made it here conjunctive. So on the one hand, you talked about an educational opportunity you were able to take advantage of, which you actually took a class. But then you had a barrier that you had to overcome, and you overcame the barrier. Why? You went to the local community college to take that class, right? Again, that's great, great, great stuff. Now, the PIQ-5 is different because they talk about the significant challenge in your life. Well, maybe you had to take care of a parent, or a relative, or grandma or granddad or an uncle, whatever the case may be, right? That's a significant challenge. Or you had to take care of a younger sibling. What about a situation because of everything that's happened that maybe that you had to go get a job because income is difficult to come by now because we've had these record unemployment claims. That's something that you can talk about that. So you can see the difference behind that and the richness of the tapestry. Remember, you had a lot of really smart people get together in a room across the UC campuses in terms of the admissions directors. You know that they know what they're doing. This is a collective effort. Another pointer that I would tell you is that one thing as a lawyer is we always care about subject matter jurisdiction, right? So when we go to a court, they have to have jurisdiction. There is jurisdiction here. The jurisdiction here is your high school. Talk about what happened in high school. Don't talk about what happened when you were in elementary school or middle school, right? I've heard admissions people, they kind of rail about how somebody said the most significant challenge they overcame was when they were 3 years old, right? Well, you know, is that germane? Generally not, right? And also at 3 years, you probably didn't have many memories of that time, right? However, there's one exception. The exception is that if whatever you overcame or had to deal with when you were that age, you will continue to deal with it in high school, then of course it's going to be material, right? But generally speaking, you want to keep it within the time that you are in high school. Now the other part that admissions is very clear on is that it is an additive process as opposed to a putative process. What does that mean? It means that if you share some information that for whatever reason it's not positive, you don't get penalized for it. They don't penalize that. Any information that they get, that they do believe is material, it adds to your score. So just imagine yourself that you're playing a video game that is keeping score, right? So the more stuff that you talk about, the more points you'll be able to get. You may not know everything about where the points are coming from, but the point is that if you don't share it, they can't give you points for it because you didn't put it down. So if it's something that is important, including experiences that were hard to take, that were disappointing, we want to talk about that. Now, why is that the case? Let me tell you why. Remember the reader. What does the UC system want, right? Think about it. If you're out there and you're recruiting somebody and you're making a decision, do I want student A or B or D or Z, right? Who are you going to select? You're going to select someone that's going to succeed in your campus. You're going to select someone that's going to reflect well in your campus. You're going to select someone that they believe is going to do great things for our society. Remember back then, everything's interconnected. Yes, it's like the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Everything is interconnected. Go back to what I said. Now I'm referencing for the third time. They care about what? They care about alumni success, right? One of the three. They want you to be successful, right? And guess what? In order to be successful, there's one part when you go to any of these UC schools. So anybody, I asked you, have you ever gone to a campus and sat in on a class? I will tell you, we sit here and we fret about student-teacher ratio, right? Before you had the class size reduction, you got a bonus if you were able to fit it into their ratio. And then when it got to certain classes, especially in elementary, when it became 40-1, we thought that was terrible, right? We had to deal with that. Well, when you go to a UC, I can tell you right now, once you take Chemistry 101, you're going to be in a lecture hall that's going to have 200 to 300 students. And unlike primary school, they're not going to care if you show up or don't show up. They're not going to care. And the first time you walk into something like this, when nobody really cares, because you're on your own, right? Because you've turned 18. I know you don't feel because you think you're going to be young forever. But once you turn 18 and once you graduate, it's not just turning 18, it's once you graduate from high school, then they're not going to be looking for you anymore if you don't show up somewhere. It's laissez-faire all over the place. So guess what? You don't have to go to class. And if you don't go to class, you're gonna suffer from it. But here's the point. The point is, for sure, when you go to a UC, you're going to encounter adversity. I promise you, you're going to encounter adversity. You're going to be in a class with so many kids, and kids you don't know. Up to this point in time, you've been growing up with kids. You've been there, elementary, middle, the whole thing, right? You know their families. You don't know any of these kids. So you have no relationship with these kids. Another thing that you'll realize, they come from all over the place. They don't just come from your neighborhood, right? What's another thing? Good luck talking to your professor. That ain't going to happen. It ain't going to happen. You'll be likely to talk to your TA, or teaching assistant, right? And what's another thing that's going to be different? Well, anybody who goes to a UC, you're going to realize the big difference is what? You can take chemistry, as an example, which is going to be 3 hours a week on a lecture, but you're also going to have 3 hours a week on a lab, right? And the lab is very difficult. It's a 1 day, evening, 3 hour lab, and it's not going to take you 3 hours. It's going to take you at least an hour to an hour and a half to prepare for it, because if you do the lab and you come up with the wrong results, you're going to have to redo it, right? And then you're going to do a report, right? So, adversity, you can hit adversity. That's why, if you do hit adversity, it's not the perfect kid who never had a problem in their life, who never had a hair out of place, who got everything. That's not the kid that the UC system necessarily would find most desirous. It's the kid that it could overcome something, because you're going to hit adversity. And because of that, they give you arguably could use that in every one of the questions, right? But the ones that you certainly can use it for are PIQ 4, PIQ 5, and PIQ 8. So think about that. Again, an additive process. If you can get over adversity, then you're going to succeed in a UC. Okay, other pointers that you should have. Do not pander. Do not provide responses you think they want to hear. Again, once you're as experienced as they are by reading thousands and thousands of these essays, they know when somebody's putting somebody on and not being genuine. So don't do that. Just tell them about you. Use your language. Don't use anybody else's language. The central star of this is you, not anybody else. So therefore, and again, you're going to find that we're going to violate so many rules of English from your high school English teacher that you just wouldn't do, right? One, already we talked about the structure. There's no structure. The other part is that I statements and me statements are not something that they see or like. They always say, well, you're writing opposite you, but guess what? This is your story. So I statements are okay, right? And how else are you going to describe it in that way? You want to go ahead and simply tell the truth. Now, obviously that's true, but you can't tell it. I will tell you this. Once you tell the truth, and they always say don't exaggerate, but I think that's a little bit too straightforward and simplistic. Of course, you don't want to do something where it becomes so hyperbolic that it becomes misleading. Of course you want to do that, right? But it isn't just telling the truth. You want to tell the truth in a happy way, kind of in a positive way, right? So imagine that from that standpoint. Also know this. They tell you to make sure that you don't plagiarize, right? So make sure you don't do that. Obviously, none of you that are listening to this would ever do that. But just know this. They do audit this. So there's a certain percentage where they will send you something. And again, it's random sometimes. Sometimes not random. If somebody said, and quoted Shakespeare, they know that's not random, right? And if you don't attribute to Shakespeare, you can get DQ'd immediately. But back to the random audit, they do a random audit, and it's a certain small percentage, but they do a random audit where they can require evidentiary proof and verification of what you've said. So if you are unfortunate to get something like that, then you're going to have to go ahead and prove it. Now, what I'm saying is, if you do what I tell you to do, you don't have to worry about that, right? And perhaps even that exercise by itself would be positive, but just be mindful of that. You don't want to violate that rule. Why? Because you violate the rule. Not only will you not be accepted, but you will never be accepted. You're going to be on a ban list, and you don't want to be in the no-fly zone. All right. Another part that they tell you is they don't care about spelling and grammar, right? Well, that's actually not true, right? So, anywhere you go, they're going to tell you, here are the 9 deadly mistakes when you write this, right? But the Quack is not going to do it like this. The Quack's going to do it differently. The way the Quack's going to do it is they're going to tell you that there are certain categories, right, to make it more sensible. There are 4 categories that you want to avoid. The first category is use your own voice. That means you don't want to quote anybody, you don't want to give dialogue, right? For one thing is, if you quote somebody else, and believe me, as a school board member, I've been to many promotions, and you certainly don't want to do, and I've had my own experience and about the number of times I've heard a Dr. Seuss quote, right? But it's not original, and they can't give you any points for that because it's not your work, right? So remember, use just who you are and what you say. And also I would tell you is that a quote also is a waste of the word count. So that's not very good either. The second category is that don't make it hard on the reader. Remember, make it easy on the reader. So remember I said earlier about the grammar, right? They don't check for grammar and spelling. But let me tell you something. If you were reading somebody and you weren't giving any points and you weren't even subtracting any points about grammar and spelling, how would you feel if you read something that was riddled with these mistakes? And then I'll also tell you this. When you have all of these things, what happens is that what you're reading is not clear. Well, the reader is not going to sit there and try to figure out what you're trying to say. If the reader can't understand it, boom, they're on to the next one, right? So, again, don't make it hard on your audience. Another part about this that fits under this category, because there are a number of one of here, is acronyms, right? You don't want to do a bunch of acronyms. If you do an acronym, you've got to define it. I'll give you a perfect acronym, CIA, right? So if you go to somebody, you say CIA, you think of Central Intelligence Agency. But in public education, that's not what CIA stands for. CIA stands for what? Curriculum, Instruction, and Assessment, right? So just be careful with the acronym. If you use it, make sure it's defined first. Now, of course, if you go to a high school, right, you can use the acronym for the high school because they should know what that is, right? But generally speaking, you don't want to go ahead and do that. You also, what they say is that you don't want to be philosophical. Well, philosophical just means that you're not being clear, right? Now, I'll tell you, most high school students have never taken a philosophy class. But when you're in college, you're bound to take a philosophy class. So I'm going to give you another prediction for the future. When you take your philosophy class, I will tell you, an overwhelming number of you are not going to enjoy your philosophy class because it is not, it's obtuse and unclear. Well, you can only imagine that as much as you think about philosophy, and by the way, I love philosophy. I don't want to say anything negative about philosophy, but philosophy is like the Socratic method. It's a search for the truth, right? So it is a necessary process of that. So I think, again, going to law school, taking a philosophy class was great. But not so much here, right? They don't want you to be philosophical. They want you to kind of get right to it. The other one is that you don't want to ask any questions, right? So you don't want to ask anybody any questions. You don't want to ask yourself a question. So as a trial lawyer, I take depositions. And so I ask questions, right? So I have somebody there, they're under oath. They have to have an affirmative obligation to answer my questions that are material relevant to the case and not protected by any privilege. And then whenever a deponent starts asking me a question, I remind them, I'm sorry, Here, I'm the one to ask the questions and nobody else. So don't ask questions. Another one, they don't like creative writing, right? So you don't want to go and do that because you want to be concise. Part of creative writing obviously is don't use what? Don't use pedantic or flowery language. They don't like that either, right? Kind of puffery and so forth. And part of that is that, believe it or not, but the reader doesn't want to read SAT words, right? Now, that's always a general rule. Is that always the case? Of course not, right? Nobody's saying you should dumb down anything, right? But these are just general posts. If you usually use the word, then use it, right? Not a big deal, if that's part of your everyday language. But I use the Thor example, which is somebody sees something and then somebody says to Thor, "Thou wearest thy mother's drapes." Well, who talks like that, right? So again, that's an exaggeration, but the point is, use your language, use your own language. The third category, waste of word count, right? Don't waste your word count. I already mentioned before about quotations, that's a waste of word count. Another waste of word count is when they ask you about leadership experience, right? And so forth. I had already recited to you what PIQ1 is, right? Well, you want to say, well, my greatest leadership experience was, and then you kind of restate the whole thing, or I positively influenced others, right? Or I resolved a dispute, or I contributed to grow for a time. You don't want to say that. Just show it, right? Just go ahead and show it. Fourth category of the no-nos is keep it professional. So, no slangs, right? No abbreviations. And also, you don't want to get into a humorous mood, right? And tell a joke or be sarcastic. We live in a country, good or bad, that's very sensitive right now. So something that's funny to you, and maybe most people, not so funny to somebody else, and they'll be offended. You certainly don't want to have your reader be one of the minority that is offended by something, right? Because then you're not going to get the points on that. So you don't have to do it. But as you can see, the Quack loves humor. So something simple is always good, right? I like something that's humorous that I read it. Why? Because it's human, right? You're human. It's human nature. It's part of the human experience. So just kind of be careful about that. But again, make sure that that's the case. Now, just like before, there's an additional comment section here, right? Other than the PIQs, and that here again is there's a word box, and it says, "Tell us anything that you haven't told us in the rest of the application." What does that mean? That means that they don't want you to continue talking about PIQ 5 that you answered. They don't want that, right? They want something different and something significantly different. Again, optional. But how many words did they give? Remember, in the past, right, before the current application, they give you 550 words. This time they give you 500 words. So again, make the argument. Is that important? They give you 500 words. Every other essay is limited to 350, right? That's a significant addition. Do you want to do more work? Human nature says no. But you should really think about it to be able to tell your story. And your story is so rich in its tapestry, and I can tell you right now, I can take any student applicant and I can write your story. Your life is interesting. It's very interesting. Let's say somebody asked you right now, just as an example, what did you do during this pandemic, right? And you want to talk about this. But you didn't go to a protest, or you didn't do this, you didn't do that. Not saying it's bad to go there, right? You just didn't do it, right? You stayed at home the entire time. Then you might think, you know what? I can't talk about that. But what about this, right? Let's say you had a friend, and you're talking to your friend, and during this time, you met somebody, and you were talking about books, and they were talking about books that you never read before, right? And one day, you were looking at a movie, you saw Clueless, and you loved the movie, right? Now you guys can look it up, it's a great movie. It's certainly before your time, right? But it was a phenomenal movie. And it was funny, and it was very contemporary. But then you realize that it was based upon Emma, which was one of the great books by Jane Austen. And I've read every one of Jane Austen's novels, right? And then because of that, and you had a friend who had Persuasion, another book. And for the first time, you decided you're going to read that. And it just enriched your life because there's certain truths that exist, even in England, back at that time period, hundreds of years ago, that still apply today. And you read that and it enriched you. How's that? That's not bad. You did something during that time. Don't think that you can't tell your story. If I was the reader, I'd be very impressed with that story. Why? Because you went where? Outside of your comfort zone. When would you ever read a Jane Austen novel, right? Probably not, right? But you read it here, and you said, wow, it had an impact on you. So, again, something like that. But in this area, I told you before, not everyone is perfect, right? And in reality, UC wants to find somebody that's not perfect. Why? Because somebody who allegedly is perfect, they never had any adversity. And I already told you you can hit adversity for sure, right? So let's say that your grade point average took a dip, right? Well, guess what? Remember, you're the interviewer also, not just the interviewee. The interviewer is going to ask you what happened during that time, right? And guess what? You got to answer it. There might be a great answer. Example, all right? Your grade point average took a hit, but at that time, you were on the football team and you got injured, and it was a significant injury, and you were devastated with the injury, but then you had to go surgery, and because of that, you had to miss time in school, and you were trying to catch up, but you also had to go through physical rehabilitation, but you were still doing it, and you were very proud because you understood that you can get over this, despite the situation. Well, doesn't that tell your story a lot better than just seeing what happened to you in terms of your grades, right? Tell the story. There are many. How about another one? Something happened with your family. You had to take care of somebody at home because they got sick. You couldn't do all these other things, right? Perfect example of this is you played basketball your entire life, right? All of a sudden, senior year, you didn't play. Are you telling me the interviewer is not going to think, why didn't you play basketball? And guess what? If you don't answer the question, what's going to happen? The interviewer may think something negatively happened. You don't want to do that, right? So talk about what happened with respect to that. So, you can do it in that section. And you can also do it in a section of what? The most significant challenge you have to overcome, which is what? PIQ 5. But, again, keep it in mind. Now, I mentioned before that the one part about this that's very unique is because of what we're going through, right? So, should you talk about what you've been doing with life being reimagined right now? Prior to March of this year, how many of us had ever even heard the term distance learning? How many, right? But now, everybody understands what distance learning is. We've gone through this. And I still remember even going through this. I remember having a school board meeting regularly scheduled on Thursday, March 12th, coming back from emergency school board meeting on Friday, March 13th, where then at that particular time we closed our schools, and then indicated at that time we weren't going to come back for 3 to 4 weeks until after spring break. And guess what? We never came back. And then we went straight to distance learning. Now that distance learning is different than what we're going through now because that was more of an emergency distance learning. Now this is more of a well-thought learning model. But the point is that you have to go through these things. Talk about it. Talk about what you've gone through. So let me also talk about another application. The UC application uses the UC application, right? And this is what we're talking about. But you should know this. The application that's the most prevalent in terms of American colleges, of which there are over 2,500, is what is called the Common App. The Common App is an association that has over 900 institutions there. So that's obviously a lot more than our UC system. Now, looking at their process is always going to be relevant as well. So in their situation, the way that they do it is they actually have a 250 word box ask you how you've been affected by the pandemic. Now, the reason why they probably do that is because, and this is a good roadmap, is you don't want to have your PIQ responses be completely fixated on what's going on right now. And the reason why is because it's very simple, is most of your life was before stay at home, and most of your life is going to be after stay at home. So this is temporary. So that we haven't gone through this, and hopefully we won't go through this for years, right? So although it's important to address, don't get carried away. It cannot be everything, right? But should it be addressed? No question, but not overly. The other part about this that I thought was very interesting is that there were some deans of colleges part of the comment, and they came and they put together a number of items that they felt were important that students should think about. And here's what they are. One is self-care, right? That is obvious. Then one was academic work, both before and after the pandemic. Service and contribution to others. So that's going to mirror, right, the PIQs. Family contribution also mirrors that. Your extracurricular and summer activities, right, this was the first summer, right, where nobody could really travel. And any other information that was important to you that you want admissions to know about, which is essentially the catch-all, right, that we use in additional comments. So, again, understand what that is. Now, when you do the UC app, it's going to be online, right? That's how it works. Opens up in August, right, so you can go ahead and do that. But the submission is only in November. So November 1st, November 30th. There's no race. If you do it November 1st, don't think that you get an advantage, because you don't, right? And why is it? Because the UC doesn't do early admits, right? So it doesn't really matter. But if you're done and you're ready to go, right, maybe you should do it. But I always say this, when I took an exam, whether I was in college or law school, and I was done before the time was up, I still would review it, right? And this is one of those things that this is more art than science. Always review it. Have somebody else look at it, right? Somebody that you trust with respect to this. Again, it's always hard to talk about yourself, but go to your friends or your family or your teacher or your counselor or your coach and ask them, what did you see that was unique to me? They might see something that you never even knew was there, right? They might actually see something like that. So, I encourage you to go ahead and do that. Now, I already mentioned some of the attributes that you want to show, right? You want to show things like communication, collaboration, citizenship, courage, compassion, personal responsibility, accountability, problem-solving skills, that is. And a number of other attributes, right? Empathy, leadership, initiative. But remember, you want to show that, you don't want to just state that. And although I could go on forever, this is at least an overview of what that will be as you go through this. And so, the quad can only leave you with this, right? I wish everyone the best of luck in the UC application process. I wish you all the greatest fortune. And as always, God bless you all. God bless your parents. God bless your families. And God bless your future.